For decades, the architects of a globalized world promoted the narrative that economic integration would ensure global peace. Open markets would dampen rivalries, trade would tether nations to each other. Politics and power would logically follow economic expediency toward a harmonious world. But today, that logic has broken down. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, president of the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, and this is Futurology. As the forces of globalization reached their zenith in the late 90s, the columnist and author Thomas Friedman offered up his Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. That is, no two countries that have McDonald's fight wars against each other. A more nuanced version of this maxim of economic entanglement was the bedrock worldview of our guest on this episode of Futurology. As Director General of the World Trade Organization at the high watermark of globalization, Pascal Lamy championed the rule-bound, market-driven, and free-flowing movement of goods around the globe as a guarantor of peace. But Lamy has changed his mind. Instead, he sees a world drifting into blocks. Markets may link people, but they don't unite them. Moscow and Kyiv, Tel Aviv and Beirut all have McDonald's. Climate shocks, sovereign data regimes, global inequality, and a rising tide of nationalism have led to less coordination and more friction. 21st century economies run on data that doesn't cross borders as cargo, but it does come with baggage. What one regime decries as surveillance, another defends as sovereignty. We're watching the World Wide Web split into regional stacks, a stack for the US, one for China, and yet another for Europe, each built on a culturally and politically informed hierarchy that dictates how information should be handled, who gets access, and what can be known. In his work today as chairman of the Paris Peace Forum, Lamy continues to reject protectionist tariffs and closed borders. Instead, he says what we need is precautionism, a system that sets guardrails for resilience rather than dominance. Lorenzo Marsili, the director of the Berggruen Institute Center in Europe, sat down at our Planetary summit in Venice to talk with Lamy about the cracks in the old system and what might hold the next one together. And now, Pascal Lamy and Lorenzo Marsili on Futurology.
Pascal Lamy, thank you very much for being with us today. I think it is a particularly important conversation because we would really like to speak about the paradigm of multilaterality and the rules-based international order, what remains of the Bretton Woods institution and that design for what came to be known as globalization, a paradigm that has today perhaps shifted quite dramatically. And you represent that paradigm perhaps better than anyone else. You've been the director of the World Trade Organization. You've been the European Commissioner for Trade, and both the trade portfolio and the European Commission itself speak multilaterality and speak peak globalization. And so I think you can really be the most precious guide in uncovering that paradigm and perhaps uncovering some of the reasons for its crisis. Before entering our conversation, I wanted to ask you a more personal question, because I think you and I will perhaps agree on many of the analyses of today's circumstances, but part of our possibly shared multilateral or global ethos might come from a contradiction of sorts. I've become a deeply committed believer in European integration, in transnationalism, as a member of, when I was in high school and I was protesting against the institute that you would soon come to direct. I was in high school at the turn of the millennium, at the peak of the so-called no global movement or alter global movement, which was actually an extraordinarily global movement of protest that was demanding another world. Another world is possible is the famous slogan. And as a silly student protesting on the street, funnily enough, against the very multilateral institutions that are in crisis today, I came to be baptized in the belief of planetary unity, if you like, or the idea that we need to understand the planet as a finite habitat for a common humanity that needs to find ways of working together and acting together. So my transnationalism, if you like, comes in protest at the inherited multilateral order. And I'm wondering where your inclination for multilaterality, for world systems, for trade first originated.
It basically came from my European experience. I was educated in the French system. I was in the French government at the beginning of my professional career. And at the time, for me, the European Union was and should be a sort of big front. The notion of integration with different positions and compromising and negotiating was not my turf. I mean, the French have always seen the European Union as a way to project France on the world scene. And I had to change my mind when I arrived in Brussels in 1995 with Jacques Delors. And after 10 years of serious European integration work, I came to the conclusion that interdependence was the way to go. Of course, a lot of what happened during this period comforted me in this vision, including, for instance, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was a formidable moment for those of us who believed that economic integration would one day lead to some form of political integration, which is what the European founding fathers had in mind. These solidarité de fait that then would bring more political union. During all that time, it worked. We did with the law of the internal market, and then we did the structural funds, and then we did the euro. I mean, the machinery from economic and market integration into political progress did work. Now, and the notion that it might be the same at global level was there. Remember Jean Monnet saying that the European integration is just one step forward, the organization of the world. So the notion that this had to go global was there. And when I landed as European Trade Commissioner, that was my view. And when I landed as DG of the World Trade Organization, it was my view. I mean, I was, in a way, comforted in this vision by the reality. If I compare this to the world of today.
Yeah, and we get to today in a moment, but to stay in the world of yesterday, to quote another famous European writer, Stefan Zweig, you mentioned your surpassing of a certain French tendency to nationalism to achieve this awareness of multilaterality and the necessity of integration. And in this, your experience may be a microcosm of a wider superseding of nationalism that the European Union, but also the Bretton Woods institutions represent. So my question to you would be, how do you read the origins of multilaterality from the destruction of World War II? What was the vision that first informed the idea to weave together a reasonable, a rational infrastructure for humanity?
Oh, I mean, when I was DG of WTO, I lived in a building which was the first real international building in Geneva, which is the International Labour Organization, which was created not after the Second World War, but after the First World War. And in my view, it's exactly the same vision, a huge catastrophe. What led to that? And how can we avoid a repetition of this, which gave rise to the International Labour Organization, which, by the way, is the only really plurilateral organization where you don't have just states, but you have also industry and labor. The Society of Nations, which we know failed. Second World War, second even bigger catastrophe with the Shoah. Again, another attempt to avoid the repetition in creating a world infrastructure of treaties, organizations, the purpose of which would be to keep peace and to promote global capitalism with the necessary infrastructures. This is what happened, and this is what led to this sort of Bretton Woods, World Trade Organization, International Labour Organization, International Telecommunication Union, and so on, that gave the impression that we had succeeded in organizing the world in a way that the growth of economic and social interdependence would be a temperance of what we know from history, which is the passion of power games. It's the notion that, in a way, to put it simply, geoeconomics in the future, the integration of the world economic system with opening trade, liberal and capitalist systems, and I think we have to recognize that the system which was put in place was capitalism at large. And we should not forget that, because the number of problems we've had with that, in my view, don't just have to do with what happened later on in terms of geopolitics regaining the upper hand, but also on the intrinsic problems of global capitalism. But the reality is that this system was highly dependent on sovereigns agreeing to do something together. The moment this willingness faded away or disappeared, and we know the fundamental reason for that, which is the US-China rivalry, back to Thucydides, the moment the world became driven in its functioning with this major backstage rivalry, then geopolitics took back the upper hand on geoeconomics, and this is where we are today.
So let's move on to geopolitics, but one last question on the world of yesterday. You've mentioned that in your view as a European Commissioner, economic integration would lead to political integration. This is an often cited neo-functionalist argument for the European Union. You've mentioned that at global level, something similar was at least aspired to through the webs of capitalism and trade. This is ultimately what also Immanuel Kant seemed to believe. I mean, Kant is very explicit that trade is precisely the way through which humanity is coming together. Then there are some other parts of Kant where he says that actually that will not happen, and so humanity will make war, and the destruction of war will bring it together. But this darker side of Kant may be where we are today. But to stay with your optimistic Kant of trade, so this is the economy leads to politics story. But then you've mentioned the International Labour Organization. And there is another story of globalization or internationalism, which is less economy first. And it's perhaps more people first, labor rights first. Even the United Nations, at its founding in the 1950s, played a geopolitically very significant role. I'm thinking of decolonization, for example. But what seems to me to have happened over the course of the second half of the 20th century is that the economy first took greater and greater a role in defining internationalism and then crafting what came to be called globalization, which was essentially financial or financialized globalization, and the people first or politics first approach, including the United Nations as an institution, lost gradually more and more power to the point of becoming rather meaningless at the turn of the millennium with the wars following 9/11. And so my question to you is, do you regret anything? Do you think the economy first model is still a good guide for reconstructing in the future a world organization? Or I'm thinking also of your work with the Peace Forum. We need to think more about politics and geopolitics in the future.
No, it's a very good question. And the frank answer is that on this sort of automaticity of economic integration leading to political integration, i.e., globalization of market capitalism leading to peace, I've changed my mind. And I've changed my mind.
Can we say this is a scoop of the podcast?
Starting from my experience of European integration. I think we have now to recognize that this vision of the founding fathers, which Delors shared to a very large extent, not 100%, and which I shared, is not the right one. Now, not that it is wrong, but what is wrong is the notion that there is a continuum between economic integration and political integration. There is a permeation of the political space by economic integration, but this is limited. You need other ingredients for economic integration to result in serious political integration, meaning disciplining the power games of geopolitics. And this, I think, is something that came clearer to my mind when I exited the European Union system and went into a world organization. Now, I still believe that globalization and global market capitalism, although I'm a critic of the capitalist system, I simply have now enough experience to recognize that what has been tried otherwise did not work. So I'm in a pragmatic situation. And I believe, by the way, a lot of the problems that people saddle globalization with, like, for instance, increasing inequalities, like financial crisis, are not globalization-driven. They are capitalism-driven. And it just happened that capitalism is now global. This being said, I believe we have to recognize within the European Union that there's something missing in the EU integration process, which comes from imagination, which comes from emotions, which comes from affection. I mean, it's great to have an internal market. It's good to have a free circulation of people, capital, and ideas, but this doesn't create feelings. By the way, if you look at our European banknotes, there's nothing more frigid than a European banknote. So we still have this problem of the sort of economic species consumer worker does not transform into a political species, which is a citizen. Now, this is true in the European Union, and a fortiori it is true at global level. We've seen that globalization, economic interdependence, has led to a period of peace, but the moment US and China decide that they are enemies, which they have done, they feel threatened by each other. They feel vulnerable. What was great before, which was interdependence, becomes a problem. Over-dependence, vulnerability. The moment identity politics are back, the moment religious conflicts are back, and they have to do, as we know, with identity politics and economics and political integration, we now have a system which is not fit for purpose.
So you seem to blame the shift away from a certain globalization and multilaterality on the US-China.
Yeah.
But how come that the US-Russia conflict over the second half of the 20th century didn't have that effect, but rather was simultaneous with the deepening of economic integration, at least in the West or in the capitalist part of the world? What is different in those two conflicts?
What is different is that the Soviet system lost. And the US model of market capitalism won. By the way, I mean, some of your colleagues at the time said this is the end of history. Now, the US-China rivalry shows that this is not the end of history. We are back into the worst part of history. I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is, and for my generation, I mean, I'm terribly saddened by this. I remember the day the Berlin Wall fell. It was the best way of my life. I may remember, inshallah, in a few years, that the worst day of my life was the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Yeah? That's a huge step back on everything I've been trying to foster, which is, again, integration so that interdependence creates the necessary bondage that although I know passions are there, I know power games are there, but that the force of this interdependence would, in a way, limit the game of power and passion. Now, I know there is something of a belief in rationality, which may be excessive, but I think where we really have to look, seriously now, is why it did not work. Now, in my view, one of the reasons why Russia can afford to cede to this nationalistic passion is because Russia is not a part of the globalized capitalist system. If you look at what's happening in the Middle East, these countries have zero serious interpenetration of economic and infrastructures.
Whereas China is the kernel of the world capitalist system and a member of the WTO. You were director of the WTO when China entered?
And Deng
You've seen it from the inside.
Deng Xiaoping did move China into the direction of integration in the capitalist system. And I'm still working a lot with China. China is a capitalist country. Their social system is nearer to the sort of brutal US one than to the sort of welfare-driven EU one. And again, I still believe that interdependence is the way to go. I often cite this example on which we worked at the time with Delors and Shimon Peres, which was about creating a water community in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors, on the model of the steel and the coal European community. We nearly got there. And had we gone there, I think this probably have changed the course of history. So what's happening, in my view, is also a demonstration that the worst things that are happening on this planet today, in Sudan, between Israel and its neighbors, in Ukraine, are in places where economic integration did not seriously happen.
And today we, of course, witness a regression of that economic integration. I'm thinking of supply chains, reshoring, tariffs, protectionism, and much of it seems to be by design. There seems to be a political desire to undo some of the interdependency that you mentioned, as
Correct.
if there were a political desire to prepare for war.
You're absolutely right. There is a tendency in this direction, and this tendency stems from the fact that the moment geopolitics take the upper hand on geoeconomics, the question of vulnerability, of security, the sort of trade-off between the efficiency of globalization, of global market capitalism, and safety security changes. If you look at your trading partner as a friend, okay. If you start looking at your trading partner as a foe, then importing a bit more of this or a bit more of that may not be the right thing to do because he might weaponize this, or I might weaponize this. That's what the US have done. The moment I think I should do that, I will also immediately think that you might do it also. So this is what has shifted. What has shifted is that the trade-off between multi-localization of production systems, expansion of trade, and security is different. Does this mean that we are heading for deglobalization? No, I don't think so. I think the US view by Trump, and to some extent by his successor, and then with Trump back in the White House, remains an exception, because it's probably the only country on this planet that can believe it can live more disconnected with the rest of the world than before. They have a series of specificities that allow them to believe that they can try and push back China, which in my view is the wrong strategy. I always believe that making China more autarkic is making China more dangerous. If you believe China is dangerous, and there are different views on that, whatever quantum of dangerosity you lend to China, a nationalistic, autarkic China will be more dangerous.
Just a parenthesis on this, I instinctively inclined to agree with you, but what do you respond to those who present the case of Russia, where Germany's, for instance, economic interdependency with Russia in terms of gas did nothing to avoid Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but actually made Europe all that much weaker when the invasion happened?
My answer is that not all economic interdependencies are the same. And that economic interdependencies which are fatal, what economists dub as fatal trade, are not the same as the ones who are built on comparative advantage. So trading minerals or oil or gas is a necessary thing, because if I have too much of that, I cannot not export it. And if I not enough of that, I cannot not import it, for reasons which have to do with the infrastructure of the economy, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why, for many, many reasons that have to do with climate change and the loss of biodiversity, I'm such a big fan of renewables. Renewables will make this world a safer place. The moment we don't have to compete with a few places where you have oil, which is so crucial for the functioning of economies and, by the way, of armies. So it's not all bad news. I mean, there may be reasons in the future for these sort of fatal dependencies which have led to wars. So my answer is oil is one thing.
Not all interdependencies
shirts
are
and
the same.
cars and food is another thing.
Yeah. And you were saying just before that the United States still believes in its exceptionality and the capacity to withdraw, at least in part, from that, from the good side of economic interdependency. I wonder to what extent you think that a certain relative decline in American power is also the basis of the shift away from the paradigm of peak globalization. It seems to me that some of the pillars for that system included a structural trade deficit of the United States with the rest of the world. Yanis Varoufakis used the metaphor of the global minotaur, having to siphon off all the excess liquidity from the rest of the world, a structural expenditure to extend security guarantees and security umbrellas onto the allies in Asia and in Europe. This is nothing new. In traditional Chinese political philosophy, the imperial system of tributary states was always conceived as a system where the central state paid more than it received in tributes. In all empires, the central actor of the empire of an imperial system has to spend money to be the central actor of that imperial system. And it seems to me that Trump clearly does not want to spend that money, whether it's trade deficits or military aid and security. But if we go even a few years back, it seems to me that to the extent that Biden may have wanted to pay that cost, the United States is increasingly unable to shoulder the cost of empire, so to speak. And I wonder to what extent a certain decline in American power is also an ingredient in a decline of globalization or of multilaterality at the very least.
That is, I would partially agree with you. The main reason of the decline of American power is the rise of other powers. And by the way, one of the reasons why the post-Second World War system, which we discussed, is where it is now, which is very severely damaged, is also because it is the product of a time where the US and Europe were dominating this planet. The BRICS and the like have something in common, which is we don't want to be under the domination of old powers. We are new powers. Now, to be very frank, they've never put on the table any serious alternative to the system. For the moment, they're just criticizing it, and in some cases trying to demolish it, like what China does in a number of UN organizations to sideline the whole human rights content of the UN Charter and the Declaration of Human Rights, which was a big ideological step forward. So we have this happening where, in my view, Trump is totally wrong, is in believing that the US trade deficit is a weakness of America. It's one of the best signs of strength that they can finance this structural enormous trade deficit because they have the dollar. So, and then we are back to what modern capitalism is about. Modern capitalism has a lot to do with the fact that the dollar remains the number one currency on this planet, and that this gives to the US a power privilege which others do not have and which they live in. And I can bet that whatever Mr. Trump says about the fact that he wants to make the central bank less independent and he believes the dollar is too high, a second mandate of Trump will not affect the dominance of the dollar on the world economy, because this is the real center of their power. This is how they can afford such a trade deficit. This is why they can afford such a budget deficit. This is why they can afford such a high percentage of military expenditure. All this leads there. So as long as this doesn't change, and it might change one day, but this day is not tomorrow, we will remain with a very high power of the US on the economic system.
Maybe this is a good transition to a look to the future and how we can construct or imagine a future system of planetary or global integration. You mentioned the dollar, and of course, during the discussions that led to the establishment of the IMF and the World Economic Infrastructure in Bretton Woods, there was a famous argument between White and Keynes concerning which should be the reserve currency of the world. And Keynes, of course, had the idea of a reserve currency that would be a global commons of sort, the bancor. Nobody's money, but humanity's. And White, of course, may advance the interests of the United States in ways that were perhaps more intelligent. That interest is being advanced today. And so the interest in the dollar taking that role. And this is the history that you've been describing. So if we have to look towards the future, and I'm thinking that in some of the conversations in the BRICS, for instance, there is constantly an argument to move beyond the world's dependency on the dollar, although nobody, of course, wants to put up their own currencies as an alternative. Do you think we should begin thinking about resurrecting Keynes' intuition concerning the bancor and really think about a world reserve currency?
Yes, definitely. And I've been thinking that for a very long time. And I discussed it when I was young with the father of one of my school friends, who was the guy who translated Keynes into French in the 1930s. And I totally agree that this would be the way to go, that this world needs economic integration that will keep happening for a variety of technological reasons, and that a common global currency is one of the commons which this world is lacking.
And let's look at other commons. I mean, you mentioned that interdependency, economic interdependency is a good for the world, and I'm thinking of the extent to which it also contributes to scientific progress and technological advance. And what we see today is a splintering, even of the internet, a splintering of data sets, a splintering of stacks, and if you like, a retreat to nationalize the internet, so that there will be a China stack, an India stack, a US stack, and data sovereignty. And some people speak about the splinternet to describe what is happening today. And I wanted to take your view of what is happening in the world of data and technology, whether you think this is an interdependency, I'm thinking about chips and AI, that should be safeguarded, or it falls more in the remit of not falling into a gas dependency towards Russia. Well, how do you read what is happening, and what do you think is a better alternative to this?
I've been working on that quite a lot in recent years, including with the Paris Peace Forum and with the Institut Jacques Delors, which I coordinate. My view on that is that the digital world is less ideologically flat than the previous one. Yep. A bicycle, a shirt, a car is the same everywhere on this planet. Data are not the same everywhere on this planet. There's something in the nature of data and of the connection of data with individuals, of the immediability of the dual use of data, whether for civilian or for military purposes, that makes the world of data inevitably more fragmented than the world of shirts or cars. In the previous world, the equation was a simple economies of scale, multi-localization of production systems, common standards. And the ideal of common standards is planes. Planes are the same everywhere on this planet for safety reasons, and it's quite a dangerous object to fly. They have to land and take off everywhere. Total standardization. We will not have that. We do not have that in the digital world. We will not have that in artificial intelligence. If you look at the US philosophy of how to regulate data, at the Chinese philosophy of how to regulate data, and at the European philosophy, they are very different. And I'm still wondering where the Indian one will be, because it will matter a lot in the times to come. So these are data are ideologically loaded, culturally, historically loaded, and we have to try and get the proper mix of convergence as much as possible. When we have the same approach, let's converge and have as much of a global regulation on this ground, but the rest has to be about organizing properly coexistence.
Where do you think we need common global or planetary regulation on AI, for instance, or data?
We need as much as possible of common regulations, and we might have them when we align enough our philosophical systems, which is why, by the way, we still have a lot to do, and I'm happy to do it from time to time with the Berggruen Foundation to understand the philosophy when it's different. And that's absolutely crucial.
It's interesting for me that you mentioned philosophy, because I think one of the important work that we have ahead of us for the future will be crafting a way of speaking about the planet, about its interdependency, about global commons, such as a new currency regime that we have discussed, in a way that is not entirely reliant, if I may say so, on the Greek mind, on the concepts that we have inherited from 200 years of exceptional Western domination over the planet, including its conceptual domination over the planet. And I think one of the extraordinary work that actually the Berggruen Institute is doing is precisely to try and go at the roots of multiple systems of thought and connect them in order to develop a new language that is not the mere replication or the mere intercultural comparison of pre-existing civilizations, but it's something new that is ever constructed with due regard to the diversity that pre-existed, the arrival of the West on the world's stage. And that leads me to the last question I want to ask you. There's a long tradition that it seems to me you are part of French statesmen who are also thinkers. Alexandre Kojève, for example, who would advise Charles de Gaulle after World War II to create Latin Union.
And Jean Monnet.
And Jean Monnet, exactly. Or André Malraux in the culture. And so I want to close by asking your view, somebody who is in the shoes of government, but also in the shoes of ideas, of how we move forward. Because it seems to me that today's politics is rather poor compared to what it was 50 years ago in terms of its intellectual capacity. And people like you are rather rare to find in governments today, or even in the European Commission. So I wonder, what do you think about the relation between intellectual speculation or academic scientific knowledge and policy making, and how we can maybe make that closer? Should we make it closer?
Absolutely. No, I definitely believe that science, philosophy, politics have to go global. Now, they won't go global in becoming the same. There are fundamental reasons why it's a good thing, by the way, to have different philosophical or political attitudes, whereas science is inevitably sort of more global. You don't have different sciences. If it's about mathematics or even astrology, it's the same everywhere on this planet. It's in a movement of its own, which I would sometimes wish philosophy and politics to have adopted, but that's not the course of history. So to answer your question, I deeply believe that they have to go global in their interdependence, interoperability, understandability. And there is an obvious contrast, and I still travel on this world north, south, and east, west for most of my time. There is an obvious contrast between the degree of globalization interdependence, and which is very high, and which will keep, although in a different speed and maybe with a different shape, and the very low level of cognitive coherence, of cognitive convergence. The amount of cognitive dissonances which exist on this planet as compared to the size of its integration is enormous. And in my view, this is one of the problems we have to solve, because for many, many reasons, globalization will keep moving. But if we don't accompany this, not just by institutions of treaties like we did it after the First and the Second World War, by sovereigns, and sovereignty means I don't care what you believe, it's my country first. This can only change if I start understanding how you behave, why you behave the way you behave. And which is why I think there is a vast bit of possible improvements, but it needs a lot of brain juice.
Pascal Lamy, I hope we can count on your help to guide through that improvement that's needed and necessary. And thank you very much for being with us today.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Berggruen, Nathan Gardells, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardells, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Magliori, and Nick Goddard.